Please welcome our moderator for this session, the Vice President, SCS Engineers, Michelle Leonard.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. What a great energy in the room this morning. Please take your seat so we can proceed with our keynote. I do a little bit of logistics, so during this session we are going to activate our electronic questions and answers. So if you have a question for our speaker, go to, on your tablet or iPhone, slido.com and enter the event code ISWA 2017. So that's Slido, SLIDO.com. And I just want to let you know that even I, as an EP, experienced professional, was able to do this. So you'll submit your questions through Slido. You can also vote on other questions from the audience, which will move that to the top of the list. And we'll be taking the Q&A after our speakers. So recent extreme weather events have certainly highlighted our concerns about climate change. And we know that solid waste management impacts climate change and that we as professionals in this industry have the opportunity and the obligation to implement materials management policies, practices, and infrastructure that minimizes our industry's impact on climate change. We have with us today two experts that are going to talk about materials management and climate change. Our first speaker is Dr. Andrew Steer, and he's the president and CEO of the World Resources Institute, which is a global research organization that works in more than 50 countries. They address 6 urgent global challenges: natural environment, food, forests, water, climate, energy, and cities. Dr. Steer joined WRI from the World Bank, where he serves as special envoy for climate change. Dr. Steers.
Thank you.
Our second speaker today is Gary Crawford. Gary Crawford is employed by Veolia as the Vice President of International Affairs, and he's based in their Paris, France office. He's responsible for establishing active partnerships with key global stakeholders and institutions to support the company's current activities in developing business. He's a member of the board of ISWA and is chair of the Working Group on Climate Change and Waste Management. He's also a member of the steering group and lead partner of the Climate and Clear Air Coalition. Please help me welcome Gary Crawford.
Thank you.
And Andrew Steers is going to start us off this morning.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Michelle. It's a great honor to be here. Last week, I spent at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, heads of state discussing peace and war, migration, trade. So why are we here discussing waste? My conviction is people in this room this morning are more influential in affecting the future of humanity and its relationship with the natural world than anybody up there in New York. And indeed, up there in New York, they actually talked about these issues. And what you have successfully done over recent years is you've taken something which, quite frankly, wasn't the sexiest issue in the world, and you've turned it into something that they're now discussing at the very highest levels. But at the end of the day, people in this room are going to make a massive difference. So I want to give you 3 cheers this morning for what you're doing and what I hope we're doing together. And cheer number 1, you are creating a historic turning point from a linear to a circular economy. It is hard to overstate how important that is for the future of humanity. Just think for a moment about the economy. For most of world history, the economy has been largely flat. And then in the 20th century, the world economy grew 20-fold. Now this coming century, if you ask economists, what do you think the world economy will grow at? A lot of them would say, well, we should be growing at 4%. If you grow for 100 years at 4%, how big will your economy grow? It will grow 50-fold. 50-fold increase this century. So last century, 20-fold. This century, maybe 50-fold. Who's good at maths? Multiply them together. That is 1,000-fold increase. So in 2 centuries, we started down here with an economy, let's say it had a total volume of 1. We will have an economy the size of 1,000 2 centuries later. Just imagine what that does. And you think of all the extracting and churning just in the last 100 years, a 34-fold increase in construction materials, a 27-fold increase in ores and minerals extraction. No wonder then that we now need trucks that, if you put them end to end, would be 5,000 kilometers long every day just to take the trash out of cities. And that will go up from 3.5 million tons in 2010 to 6 million tons in 2025 to 11 million tons. So no wonder we are filling the world up with stuff. We are literally swimming in it. This is actually a river, believe it or not. And someone just asked, the youngsters asked, what about marine debris? This is it. That's how serious it is. And obviously in developing countries, it's also very tragic because the health effects and the danger is even greater. So look, we are on an amazing journey, a historic turning point from take, make, waste to reduce, recycle, reuse. And people in this room are at the center of that. Now, in the old days, we actually used to be quite good at recycling. This is exactly 100 years ago, when recycling rates were much higher than they are today. We now need to go back to learning how to do it. We need historic turning points. Back in 1987, in this country, it was one. Do you remember the Mobro garbage barge? 6 million pounds left New York City to go to North Carolina. North Carolina said no thank you, went to 5 other states, went to 3 countries, went 5,000 miles, and nobody would take it. And as a result of that, we started getting the most amazing legislation in all the states and municipalities around the United States. We need these kinds of political prods all around the world now to get to where we need to get to, which is to shrink our footprint very substantially. So that's cheer number 1. Cheer number 2, you are pushing forward an economic transformation that is of historic proportion, from waste to resource efficiency. Look, I last couple of weeks ago had the privilege of going to the Montgomery County recycling facility. Go there. I think it's one of your field trips. It's fantastic to see the progress they're making as we're now gradually putting value into waste. McKinsey tells us that every year $2.6 trillion of good things are put in landfills and incineration. And if you look at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the European Union have said that if we could only implement the new policies that the European Union is putting forward, our economy in 2030 would be 7% higher and we'd create 1 million jobs. Accenture has done some work showing that actually there is a $4.5 trillion economic opportunity worldwide simply from doing these things. Just take food loss and waste alone. As you know, 1/3 of all food in the world never reaches the human mouth. As a result, we lose $1 trillion every year. There is money to be made in this, and you guys are the ones that are actually pointing that out and demonstrating that it is possible. And of course, there are huge returns. Take food loss and waste. The British government has demonstrated by investing $1 or £1, you get 250 pounds return. Astonishing returns. You want to address climate change? Address waste is the best possible way of addressing climate change. It's the best possible way of promoting economic growth and jobs. So we need to do it a lot more. So from linear take waste, this is the current approach. Pollution and disease goes up, resource depletion goes up, and the economy and jobs go down. As we transition now to a circular economy, pollution and waste go down, disease go down, resource depletion goes down, and the economy and jobs goes up. We need to get this message out loud and clear. And now cheer 3, and we come to climate change, as Michelle has already mentioned. So instead of garbage and waste being a major cause of climate change, this industry now is becoming a major solution to climate change. Now, you may have whatever politics you like, but the plain fact of the matter is 99% of scientists will tell you that climate change doesn't cause hurricanes, but it makes them much, much worse. Warmer water means more evaporation. Warmer air can hold more water. Higher sea levels, more storm surges, more people get killed, more damage, and so on. So too, climate change causes drought with unbelievably tragic consequences. Here's where we are today in terms of greenhouse gases. This is what we will be on our current trajectory. This is where we need to be in 2050, and we had a Paris climate deal that took us to there. So we're making progress, but not enough. Now, not everyone in the world thinks it's a good idea. Mr. Trump says, I'm taking you out of Paris because it's going to cost our economy $2.5 trillion. Well, 1,000 companies around the United States, their CEOs wrote a letter to Mr. Trump and said, we disagree with you, Mr. Trump. You're getting bad advice. This is yesterday's economics. In fact, there is a $19 trillion bonus from staying in Paris and implementing smart climate policies. This is equivalent to the total stock market value of the largest stock market in the world, the New York stock market. And of course, the good thing about this country is that there is a lot of progress, even although the federal government isn't supportive. This is Mayor Bloomberg, not only mayors of big cities, but also municipalities, and often driven by the innovation in the waste management industry. They say, we are going to move forward and be a leader in this space. What's that got to do with waste management? Well, it's estimated that half of all the greenhouse gas emissions come from materials management. And that's what you and we, of course, are all about. And so, just as this is where we are, that's where we could be, this is where we need to be, that's where Paris will get us, so too circular economy strategies can push us down and get us to where we need to get to. So those are the 3 cheers. So let me take my hat off to you and to the 2 wonderful organizations that have made this meeting possible. Where next? Well, we've got a long way to go, quite frankly. I must say, for me, it was such a joy to go and see Montgomery County and see how far they'd come along. But actually, we've still got, quite frankly, just 1 foot in the door. We recycle 35% in the United States, Australia more, South Korea, Germany just had its election yesterday. But quite frankly, we've got to move to a fully circular economy. This is the United States, still over 50%. By the way, none from Montgomery County municipal collections go to landfill now, which is wonderful. This is the United States. This is Europe. So you can see Europe's quite a long way ahead of the United States. But so too, we're all on a journey. And the brilliant thing about this meeting here today and tomorrow is that we're going to share experience of best practice, recognizing this is not easy, but learning from each other. So look, 3 cheers and thank you. As a representative of the non-governmental organization movement, I want to thank you for what you're doing. You're creating a historic turning point from linear to circular. You're creating an economic transformation from waste to resource efficiency. And you are, instead of being a cause of climate change, you are an incredibly important part of the solution. So thank you, ISWA. Thank you, SWANA. Thank you to the municipalities from all around the world that are represented here. Thank you to the private sector, which is pushing forward incredible new innovations. And I think we're going to hear from one of the best right now. Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to you, and I'm really pleased to have been able to take part in this session. And as you know, I do spend a lot of time working within ISWA, but also I think I better use my, almost forgot, it was almost a presentation without slides. How can you do that? So anyway, as I mentioned, I'm working in ISWA, but also my day job is actually with Veolia, which I'm sure you've all heard about. And for those of you who don't know, we design and provide water, waste, and energy management services for industry, commerce, and households. Our tagline, Resourcing the World, talks to our commitment to a circular economy, one of the subjects that I'll definitely be touching on today. And it's really great to have the opportunity to be on stage here with Andrew and to share some of our experiences with so many peers. As the title of my presentation suggested, I feel confident, or I should say excited, about the future resource management economy that's not only efficient and sustainable, but also is more commercially lucrative than we can imagine. You saw the numbers from Andrew's presentation. But we will only realize these benefits if we get a few things right and right away. No time to waste, as David mentioned. So the next 10 minutes or so, what I would like to do is just touch on a couple of sticking points that are holding us back from meeting the immense and untapped opportunities out there. I'm going to really zoom in on something that we've been exploiting in Veolia and ISWA, along with other organizations. I'm going to touch on avoided emissions and how we can more accurately highlight climate benefits of waste and resource management. I will also throw in some examples that we have from Circular Economy in Action at Veolia, and then I'll just have a few recommendations for us to reflect on over the coming days. But before I go and get ahead of myself, I just wanted to do a quick recap on the state of play in terms of the world climate negotiations. Since the Paris Agreement, which is not a perfect deal, but is one of the most ambitious we've seen to date, governments have been fleshing out their own country action plans. We've also seen more cities, businesses, and investors mobilizing. But the latest reports remain pretty gloomy. Global absolute emissions are still increasing, and more mitigation actions are needed to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, as pledged by the 195 countries. And current commitments address only half of the gap, as you've heard, between business as usual and the ideal 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And this is really way less than what we need to do to avert runaway climate change. And you saw this presented in a different way, but here's the thing. There is potentially a powerful solution that is not being talked about in the climate discussions, and it's called the circular economy. Instead of thinking about resources as being on a one-way trip to a landfill, by rethinking how we design, consume, and reuse and recycle things, we could avoid half of the estimated emissions, totaling 7.5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. In other words, a circular economy could close the remaining gap to get us to the 1.5 degrees target. And in fact, we've already heard about Ellen MacArthur Foundation. In a joint report by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and also McKinsey, they predict that in Europe at least, emissions could be reduced by as much as 48% by 2030 and 61% by 2050 by putting into practice the principles of circular economy in the areas of mobility, food, and built environment sectors. So the economic benefits are equally compelling. You heard about those in Andrew's speech. For example, for recycling, what we would see, the vision is that in a circular system, it will deliver value by producing quality raw materials that are sourced from recycling and are competitively priced and have a smaller environmental footprint than their virgin equivalent. And that's what we're really looking for. So the next slide. The problem is that the vast potential of closed-loop systems that we have today really remain largely absent from the UNFCCC's inventories needed to implement Paris. And that's generally because closed loops are rarely accounted for. Studies by various bodies indicate that this sector actually contributes far more greenhouse gas abatement than is currently reported in the waste part of the inventories. And here is just an example that I have from France, and it's just to show that changing waste management practices can generate sufficient and significant benefits when seen through the lens of emissions avoided by reusing and recovering materials. Making new products using secondary raw materials produce far less CO2 emissions than extracting virgin material from the environment. And in the area of plastics, we see that the use of recycled PET emits 70% less than CO2 than the production of virgin PET. And when you think of it like that, circular becomes much less of a buzzword and much more of a realistic mitigation strategy for the Paris Accord. And we see that it's already happening. On this next slide behind me, we see a photo of our polymer plant in the Netherlands. It's part of a network of plastic recycling plants in Europe, and it turns plastic from consumers and industry into high-quality polypropylene granulates that are then used for electronic appliances, automotive, and also packaging products. Thanks to the versatile property of the polypropylene, the innovative technologies that are deployed at this facility, we can see where plastics can be given a second, third, and fourth life. And over the last 4 decades, Veolia Polymers has been renowned for its innovation that preserve the value of polypropylene and in turn actually conserve the mineral resources such as oil, and also protecting the environment from plastic waste, as well as reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And so we see the stats behind me give you an indication of the untapped potential that we have in terms of the plastic recycling market. We see that most of the plastic is used only once. 95% of its value is lost. 32% of the plastic escapes collection and ends up in our oceans and urban drainage, as you've seen. But these challenges can really turn into opportunities. To do this, it will take significant collaboration. For us, we've joined platforms such as the ISWA Task Force on Resource Management and the New Plastics Economy Initiative, because we know that we need to work together with very different organizations all across the value chain to overcome the drawbacks that are currently holding back the transition to a circular economy and to the use of these low-carbon solutions. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more. So I guess you can tell this is a photo from France, but this is, again, getting on the point of food waste. So we said that plastics are really a big piece of the circular pie. Another is food waste. Astonishingly, the waste stream is only surpassed by China and the United States when it comes to greenhouse gas sources. It's the third largest climate change source globally because of its methane potency, which is it has a global warming potential 28 times that of CO2 in a period of 100 years. And so this isn't really just a climate change tragedy. It's more of a moral issue when we remind ourselves that 13% of the population of less developed countries is malnourished. And so we know that certainly the prevention of food waste is really key. However, unavoidable, inevitable food waste still has a value as a resource. The good news is that there are existing technologies. This biorefinery in Denmark combines advanced water treatment with biogas technologies in one full-scale demonstration project. Using proprietary thermal hydrolysis and anaerobic digestion technologies, the plant simultaneously treats the wastewater from the city's 70,000 residents and the organic waste from agriculture, industries, and residents. The biogas generated is transformed into electricity and heat, and the nutrients are utilized in a very effective and odor-free organic fertilizer. The process opens utilization possibilities as well to preparing interesting byproducts such as phosphorus for fertilizer and biodegradable bioplastics. So we see at this facility, through the energy recovery, they're reducing 2,700 tons of CO2 equivalent already. And again, it's closing the loop and reducing or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. And we have seen that a number of plants using biogas in Europe and elsewhere has really continued, using the biogas as a fuel. And we see that there are 14,000 anaerobic digesters in operation in Europe. And we can add these to the number of composting facilities and also the biorefineries that are multiplying. And what we know is that, just getting back, Veolia has come a long way. We started in 1853 when we were delivering drinking water to emerging cities across France. We certainly don't claim to have all the answers, that's for sure. But what we do know, and we think with our heritage, that what really makes us aware that when there's change in the air, there's always a business opportunity. Our founders probably could never have thought of or foreseen an end of waste actually happening today, but we see the prospect is becoming more and more real. In fact, products and services that can be considered circular now amount to an estimated 3.5 billion euros of our annual revenues. So, as we now take a look ahead, it's more of a call to action, but I would say, where do we go from here? In short, what we really need to do is we need to start seeing the impact and potential of our sector properly reflected in our greenhouse gas reporting and within the national and global climate strategies. In a world where materials are continuously cycling through the economy more and more, as we're seeing, the issue of avoided emissions cannot be ignored. And so we need to get the reporting right. While greenhouse gas reporting has become more and more rigorous over the years, there is still some way to go in terms of ensuring all stakeholders that the true potential of avoiding emissions through material and energy recovery. Showing the true greenhouse gas costs and opportunities is especially true for waste companies like ourselves, where avoided emissions are so prevalent and significant. At Veolia, we estimate that we've avoided 12.4 million tons of CO2 equivalent in the past 2 years. And we see that summits like the one we're attending here are really great opportunities to agree to explore these types of issues. Over the next few days, I invite anyone here to really meet with us and consider joining the ISWA working group in a consortium to discuss the best way for the developing more harmonious and robust quantification methods that set common goal guidelines and really provide the confidence, comparability, and credibility that we need to key stakeholders, including investors. What we see is more and more investors looking for green investments, and what they need to see is really what are the benefits from this. And we see that today our quantification, there's a number of existing tools that exist, they're working, but what we need to do is, on an international basis, harmonize some of the approaches. So we're really looking for anyone who is interested in taking part. We will be moving ahead with that and trying to come up with some solutions. And again, it's really to raise the profile of our sector, especially now when there's more and more investors looking for these types of projects, and they're looking for that kind of evidence. And so, while we're working on the metrics, we need to also encourage government to integrate circular economy strategies into the country actions from the Paris Agreement. All of the countries are working on this. At Veolia, for example, we're actively providing input on waste proposals to the EU, who are putting in place their circular economy package. And in ISWA, we're leveraging our influence to inspire change. Take, for instance, our declaration on climate change and waste and resource management. It remains a powerful tool for us to really draw the attention of decision makers, and to have that. It's really been very effective since the COP21, and we're still using that. And finally, I would just say we must really think creatively to attract the financing needed to keep pushing the envelope in this space. Yes, we can say the Paris Agreement, the Paris goals are really monumentally challenging, and it's I would say that I'm convinced that it's possible if we build the infrastructure that is desperately needed to allow materials to circulate, and if there is rapid mobilization and innovation as a result. We don't have the luxury to procrastinate any further. There's no time to waste, as we said, and I'm speaking to a room of some of the really most influential players in the sector, and we have a responsibility and an unprecedented commercial opportunity to shape and influence the birth of a truly effective global closed-loop resource sector, and this would be one that can really contribute to significant emission reductions. Thank you very much for your time.
So as we said earlier, there was an opportunity to ask questions, and hopefully you've already entered some, and you can continue to as well. So we have a few questions already, and what I'll do is ask our speakers to volunteer to respond to them. Our first question is a true global circular economy possible with today's current technology and supply chain? And if yes, what's the holdup? And if no, what needs to change? Andrew?
Well, let's say you can get very, very close to where we need to get to with today's technology. But the wonderful thing about technology is that it's continually improving. And one thing we've learned about technology is that it responds amazingly to good policies. So you know how, for example, when the government says to the automobile industry, you must get more miles per gallon, and they say, oh, can't be done, it'll cost too much money, it'll never be possible, cars will cost a lot more. Well, it turns out that every single time that's been tried, the technology responds very rapidly. And as we look at, say, the cost of renewable energy, solar energy, which has fallen by 99.6%, in the last 25 years, so too we need precisely that kind of drive when it comes to circular economy. What's the holdup? That's the really good question. There are several holdups. One is a knowledge gap. Not every municipality understands what's out there. Certainly budget holders in municipalities and governments don't know that they could get a fantastic rate of return if they just put more money in. Private financiers don't get this yet. The banking system is not where it needs to be. So there's a major issue of knowledge. There's another issue of vested interest, quite frankly. There are a lot of companies, individuals, powerful people that actually do very well out of make, waste. And just as in every other revolution, we need to find out how to tweak incentives so that even they are not as resistant as they are at the moment.
Of course, there's a lot of data out there. We're using data today to get your questions. One of the questions was for you, Gary. What is Veolia doing in regards to big data?
Very good question, and one that's really important for our company. We actually have a team that are working on that. We're working with IBM on the tool that we're using, and it's very focused on smart cities and how to deal with that data and use it in the best way. And it's not only waste, there's waste opportunities, but also in water and energy management, all linked together. So it's a really exciting opportunities that are going on. There are cities that are really seeing that that's the future. And it's getting very efficient. It's really some opportunities, whether it's in terms of the logistics for collection, or whether it's dealing with the flows of water and energy efficiency. All of that come into play. So I think big data we're going to see lots of things happening very quickly in terms of big data and managing that, and having cities really looking at all of those areas and doing it in a more efficient way. And also, what's really interesting is there's a number of examples in the cities where the citizens are getting very much involved, where they're also providing some of the data, the real-time information about how the service is, how there's issues, and just informing the central control center about what's going on. And that's quite powerful.
One of the questions is in regards to climate change and developing countries and their impact on climate change, obviously less than those of developing nations. How can we balance that?
Well, yes, I mean, it's a concern that we need all countries to engage, but it's actually a bit of a myth to say that developing countries care less about climate change. Actually, developing countries are more affected by climate change than our rich countries. If you live in New York City, quite frankly, you can afford $100 billion to build all kinds of concrete defenses. But if you live in Jakarta or Lusaka, you can't. So actually, developing countries care much more about climate change than we do in rich countries. But of course, addressing climate change requires some financial resources, even though it pays for itself. But some of the most exciting things on climate change are happening in the developing world. I mean, obviously, the number one leader in the world on renewable resources is China right now, investing more than twice what we are in the United States and more than twice what the whole of Europe is on solar energy. And the Prime Minister of India just announced that he's going to go from 3 gigawatts of solar to 100 gigawatts in just 7 years, which would be the most rapid increase ever. But the point on the waste is important. Because as was mentioned before, I think, Gary, you quoted IPCC, which is, it turns out that waste management is one of the best ways to address climate change. It's the most cost-effective, and it's got win-win attributes because it's good for your economy as well as good for people, sort of thing. But people don't know that. And so we've got a huge job to do, whether in rich countries or in poor countries, in getting that message across.
And if I could just add to that, is that what we see now in developing countries, there is lots of movement, and they would really like to advance in terms of the technologies that are out there and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, but in a number of other sustainable development benefits that go along with it. And I think that what we do have and we do see is there's been a history in terms of the regulations and policies and what works and what hasn't worked. And there's a lot of discussions and exchange going on how that can be adapted to the developing countries. And by doing so, what is hoped is that we can really leapfrog and really advance quickly on some of these technologies in developing countries and not have to go through the 30 years that we took to start improving and increasing our recycling rates and other indicators.
So there's a lot of course, discussion about China's national sword policy and concern that that could actually lead to more marine litter, the devaluation of recyclables, and concerns about, how are we going to get the plastics out of the ocean if we don't have the ability to recycle. But the second question was, is there a silver lining to the national sword policy?
Well, I would say, when you look at what's taking place, it's the second time that this kind of restrictions coming from China. And what they're asking for is that what they're saying is they don't want poor quality materials coming into their country. And when you look at that short term, that has some significant impacts because, that's where the flows have been going. It gets cut off. And I think that can really be, in the short term, a real problem. But it has to be a driver for saying that, we need to have bales that have very little contamination, that we're working with clean materials coming into these facilities, that there are standards for that, and that it will have to drive up the quality for the materials and therefore improve the recycling rates and improve the whole situation. So I think in the long term, it will be beneficial, but we really need to look at it and start also looking at the possibilities within the different countries of being able to manage more of those materials within the country. And I think that's what also will be an outcome of this.
So it sounds like we all need to work together, government, business, NGOs, to solve our waste problems. Can you share any successful situations where that's occurred? What are the critical success factors?
Well, one thing we've learned is that as if it's not obvious, it should have been all the time, that one agency can almost never solve a problem. Government can't solve the most important problems in the world. Municipalities can't solve them. Cities can't solve them. Private sector can't solve them on their own, but they can if you come together. Both Gary and I mentioned the issue of food waste, for example. I mean, fascinating. If you go to some countries now where they're now setting policies and the private sector are working together. There's something called Sustainable Development Goal 12.3, which says the world should reduce food loss and waste by half by 2030. And an example of that is something that we've been working on. Is called Champions 12.3. And we invited 40 ministers from countries all around the world and an equal number of CEOs of companies. It's chaired by the head of the third biggest supermarket in the world, Tesco, and the head of the World Farmers Union. It's got UN agencies on it, but most importantly, it's got a combination of private and public. And so, for example, last week in New York at the General Assembly, the Consumer Goods Forum, which is the 400 largest food companies in the world, which account for about 40% of all the food eaten in the world, they announced several things: a common approach to measuring food loss and waste, an accelerated commitment to reduce food and loss and waste in their own facilities so that they'll halve by 2025, and very importantly, they announced a radical reform of date labeling. You know, at the moment, you have this dreadful date which says sell by, and that leads my 15-year-old son, looks at it, throws it away. He refuses to eat it. It's a meaningless date, absolutely meaningless. Last week, they agreed, together with some governments who are supporting them, to change that. That's the kind of sort of public-private working together. And countries like the Scandinavian countries, like Denmark, are doing amazing things, public and private. The UK has just lowered food loss and waste by 17% by setting up, a sort of half public, half private organization called WRAP, working together with people like the head of Tesco's, who in the UK is one of the biggest places. He can go in, sits with the Prime Minister, argues with each other, reaches a common position. So there's a lot going on out there.
And we could probably talk about that for hours, but we have a lot more sessions that follow this one. Appreciate everyone's questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but we've got the next 2 days for a lot of opportunities for dialogue and questions. I'd like to thank both of our speakers again, and all of you for attending our keynote address this morning. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you. Thank you very much.